Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I really wanted to film a video on the 4 Natasha Denona palettes that I have in my collection. I've done this with ColourPop palettes quite a few times over the years because they're constantly releasing new palettes, and I'm just going to sit down and chat about them, do some reviews, let you guys know the pros and the cons of each palette and which palettes in my collection compare to these. I do have 4 of the medium-sized Natasha Denona palette. She does have 4 at the $65 price range, which is still expensive for a palette. So I feel like a lot of thought goes into whether or not you should purchase one of these, and ever since she's been releasing more of them, I've gotten questions as to which one I recommend. So I'm going to go through each of the palettes and share pros and cons, let you guys know what I think stands out about each palette, and then also which palettes in my collection compare to these in case you guys already own those. I am going to film 1 or 2 looks for each palette and combine all of them into one video. I was going to do that in this video, but I didn't want this video to be like an hour long, so I figured this would be the review and then that video will be up in the next few weeks. I'll put timestamps in the description box below if you guys want to jump ahead, but I'll kick it off with the newest one, Glam, then I'll talk about Bronze, then I'll talk about Love, and finish up with Sunrise. Okay, so let's kick it off with the most recent release. This one is the Natasha Denona Glam Palette. This one is a cooler and neutral toned eyeshadow palette. You kind of get a mix between cooler tones and neutral tones, but it's definitely different than a lot of warm toned neutral palettes on the market. With this palette, you can get some really nice and easy everyday looks. You can get something really dramatic and smoky. So this palette does come with 5 matte shadows. There's a nice mix between lighter shades and deeper shades, and then you get 10 metallics. Now 9 of the metallics are just true metallic shadows. There is one kind of sheer topper shadow in this palette. So I wanted to include a section on what sets each palette apart. So what sets this one apart is that this one is labeled a little bit differently. As you guys can see, it says center eyelid, outer eyelid, inner corners. So they kind of named them based on where they think you would apply them to the eyes. Now obviously that is a complete suggestion, you don't have to go with that, but I think if you are a beginner or you struggle with eyeshadow placement, that might actually be helpful for you. What's nice about these palettes is you can actually pop the shadows out and rearrange them. So if you don't like the shade names, you can actually move them around based on how you would wear them on the eyes, which again can be really helpful, especially if you kind of find like a go-to look that you love and you want to recreate it over and over. That might help you keep track of where to place the shadows a little bit easier than other palettes. Obviously, what sets this one apart is the fact that it is a cooler toned neutral palette, and there are cool tone neutral palettes on the market. I'll actually share a few with you guys in just a second, but it's just not as common to see that from brands. A lot of brands are still doing really intense, bronzy, golden, warm-toned neutral palettes, so it is nice to see this. So when it comes to cons, I do think that the metallic shadows in here aren't necessarily as vibrant as a lot of the other Natasha Denona metallics that I've tried. I do think the shade selection comes into play when it comes to that because there are some toned down muted colors in this palette, but I do find that sometimes I have to build up a couple of the metallic shadows, and that's never been an issue for me when it comes to Natasha Denona metallics. But again, I do think the muted shade selection kind of comes into play when it comes to that. The matte shadows are perfect. They blend out very easily. I don't have any issues with those. And a lot of the metallics perform very, very well. I just find that I kind of have to layer them up just a little bit more than I have with other palettes of hers. I think another possible con for some people might be the fact that there are way more metallic shadows than matte shadows. There are 2 times the amount of metallic and shimmer shadows in this palette, which for me is definitely a plus. I love metallics, especially her metallic formula in general. So I like having a lot of different options, but I know a lot of people prefer to have more matte shadows. So if that is you, that's definitely something to keep in mind because you're paying for a lot more metallic shadows than you are mattes. So as for similar palettes, I definitely think the Anastasia Beverly Hills Sultry palette is pretty similar overall. This palette does come with the shade Bloom and then also the shade Birch that are a little bit brighter compared to some of the shades in the Glam palette. But overall, I do find that I'm able to get very similar looks on the eyes. Now the formulas are completely different. Anastasia's matte shadows are a lot more powdery. They also blend out very, very quickly. And then the metallic shadows in here tend to be a little bit more sparkly on the eyes. So, I mean, it comes down to personal preference. This palette isn't sold anymore, so if you missed out on this and you really like the color story, you might enjoy the Glam palette. This one is definitely the most similar. I would also say that the ColourPop Going Coconuts palette is similar. Mine is looking so rough because it is one of my favorite palettes, but this kind of has more muted, cooler toned, and neutral toned shadows in it. I would say there are maybe only like 1 or 2 true dupes in this palette, but again, if you're just going for like a very simple neutral look, whether it's toned down or even a little bit more smoky, you can probably get the majority of those looks with this 9-pan palette, and this one is fairly affordable. The last palette in my personal collection that looks pretty similar is the e.l.f. New Classics palette. Now this one is not exactly the same by any means, but there are a lot of shades that are cooler toned, a little bit more subdued. You could probably create a very, very similar look using this one. I definitely think the Natasha Denona formula is significantly better than this particular e.l.f. palette, so I wouldn't really recommend this one as an alternative, but if you have this palette and you're happy with it, I don't think you need to run out and buy the Glam palette. The last palette I wanted to mention is one that I don't own. The Natasha Denona Mini Glam definitely has some shades that are very, very similar. That one is a mini palette that comes with 5 shadows, and you could probably create some very similar looks. If you do prefer more of a small palette, that might be a better option for you than the Glam palette. But if you are someone who likes to have a lot of different shimmer options, I think you'll enjoy this one. Despite the fact that a few of the shimmers require just a little bit of building, I definitely think that this is going to be one of my staple palettes. It's just nice to have a cooler toned staple neutral palette that does perform pretty well, that you can kind of reach into and create a look very quickly. I can do a pretty dramatic smoky eye in just a few minutes, and that's not always the case with a lot of palettes because sometimes cooler tone shadows or like those dark charcoaly grayish brown shadows can be difficult to work with, but I enjoy using this one and I always like how my looks turn out. Next, I want to talk about the Natasha Denona Bronze Palette. In my mind, this one is kind of like a warm-toned version of the Glam Palette, and maybe just a little bit more fun. Okay, so overall, this is a warm-toned, bronzy, golden palette. There are maybe 2 cooler tone shadows in the upper right-hand corner, but overall, you're going to get some sort of warm, bronzy look. I like this palette for quick and easy everyday looks, medium-toned, sultry looks. You can kind of get like an easy, everyday smoky eye using this one. This is the one that I have on my eyes today. So this palette has a range of finishes. There's definitely more versatility with the textures in this palette compared to the Glam palette. It does come with 5 true matte shadows. These perform perfectly. They're so blendable. There is one matte shadow in here that she kind of describes as like a creamy powder matte, which can be used wet or dry. When you use it dry, it's not super intense on the eyes, but obviously if you want to wet your brush, you can get a little bit more of a smoky look using the shade Deep Dive. And then there are 9 shimmer shadows. Now on the Natasha Denona website, she doesn't label them differently. Like some of the palettes have a breakdown as to what each shadow would be considered. She just says that there are some shimmers, some satins, duochromes, metallics. So there really are a range of finishes. They all look a little bit different on the eyes. So what sets this palette apart for me is the fact that I can reach for it every single day for like easy everyday looks, and I can go day to night with it, and it's just fun and I don't get bored with it. Now some of the Natasha Denona palettes that I have really intense colorful shades or they're very vibrant, and I don't find that I will reach for them on an everyday occasion. I might, reach for them once a week, twice a week, but this is a palette that I could easily use every single day and not feel like I need to rotate it out and try something different. If you like warm tone shadows and you like shimmer shadows, this is going to be an ideal option for you. Sometimes when you're paying $65 for a palette, you really want a palette that you're going to get a ton of use out of. And if you tend to wear neutral tones, this palette might be a great option for you, or the Glam palette if you like something a little bit cooler. And as much as I love colorful shadow, I do find that overall I tend to reach for more neutral palettes more often. So it's kind of nice when you pay a significant amount of money for a palette to be able to get a lot of use out of it. And I really do feel like I get my money's worth with this palette because I do end up reaching for it so often. I do feel like the quality of this palette is the best out of all 4 of the ones that I'm talking about in today's video. Now when it comes to Natasha Denona eyeshadows, I do think that her quality is very, very nice. Obviously that's why you're paying a little bit more. So I don't have an issue with the palettes as a whole. I do think they perform well well for the $65, but I do feel like within each of the other palettes, there are maybe 2 or 3 shadows that aren't quite as good as some of the other shadows. When it comes to this palette, I feel like all of the shadows perform well. I don't experience any patchiness. I don't find that I have to layer the shadows up over and over to get the pigmentation that I want. I guess the only shadow in here that I don't love is the shade Deep Dive, which is kind of like that satin black. I did use it on my eyes today, but like I said, you can wet your brush if you want more of an intense look. I just don't prefer to kind of wet my brush for satin or matte shadows. But I guess other than that, I don't have an issue with the palette. And I've kind of come to appreciate that and the shade Rhodium because they are different for this palette. I also love the fact that you do get so much versatility within the textures. Now, as for the cons, a lot of people say that you get very similar looks on the eyes and that all of the shimmers end up looking the same because it is more of a medium toned palette. While there is range when it comes to the textures in the palette, there's not necessarily a lot of range when it comes to the tones. There's like one light tone, one deep tone, but overall they tend to be very medium toned. If you're looking for a lot of versatility out of a palette and you want to create really easy, simple looks or something a little bit more colorful and dark and dramatic, this probably won't be the palette for you. If you look at this palette and these are the looks that you wear every single day over and over, then you're going to really enjoy this one. Again, the matte to shimmer ratio is a little bit off with this one and you get a lot more shimmers than you do matte shadows, just like the Glam palette. So if you tend to prefer your matte shadows compared to your shimmer shadows, you're going to want to skip over this one as well. Again, I love having more shimmer shadows, so for me, that's a plus, but for you, it could be a con. So looking at palettes in my collection, I think the Soft Glam palette comes pretty close to this one. I think that there are a lot more shimmer options in the Natasha Denona Bronze palette, but the matte shadows are pretty much identical, and there are a couple of shimmer shadows that look very similar as well. So if you have the Soft Glam palette, you could probably skip over the Bronze palette unless the shimmers in the bronze are really appealing to you, because that's the only thing that's really missing from this. The only other palette in my collection that kind of comes close is the Whatever palette. Again, the Whatever palette has like those berries mixed in, so if you do like berry tone shadows, that might be a good affordable alternative for you, but there are definitely some like warm bronzy shades in here as well. They're definitely not dupes by any means. I was just trying to pull out some palettes that looked a little bit similar. So if you guys have any other recommendations for similar palettes in your collection, you'll have to let us know in the comments below. Overall, I will say that this is the palette that I reach for the most out of the 4. I just love using it for an everyday palette, and I like the fact that I get so much use out of it because it was a $65 palette. So it's nice that it doesn't just sit in my drawer and only get pulled out on occasion. It's something that I reach for a lot. Next, let's talk about the Natasha Denona Love Palette. This is the only one that's labeled as limited edition. The rest of them are part of her permanent line. This was released back in February and it hasn't been discontinued yet. So I don't know exactly how long it's going to be around for, but you can still get your hands on it. So if you guys know me, you know that I love pink and purple eyeshadow. They are 2 of my favorite shades to wear. And if you feel the same, this palette might really appeal to you. It is a pinky purple toned palette with a mix of cooler toned neutrals. And it really does have a lot of pink and purple shadows. In fact, 10 out of 15 shadows are some sort of like pink or purple or red, and then the other 5 are neutral tones. So again, this is really going to appeal to you if you like those colorful shades. If not, it's not going to be one to add to your collection. Now this palette definitely has some more versatility overall. There are 7 true matte shadows in here, and then there are 2 matte shadows that are kind of like that creamy powder texture. For me, they kind of feel like satin shadows, and again, I know that you're meant to go in with like a wet brush to really intensify them. I just prefer like her true matte shadow formula, but I think, you know, they're meant to be used a couple of different ways. I just find that they're not as vibrant as the other matte shadows, so it's not necessarily my favorite formula, but if you do like a little bit of a softer look, you might enjoy those. And then there are 6 shimmers in here. A couple of the shadows are duochromes, and then a couple of them are just true metallic shadows. So what sets this palette apart for me is the fact that it's such a vibrant, colorful palette. Obviously, it's a very pink and purple palette, but it's more cool toned, and you can do a lot with this. There's so much range going on here, so you can do an all pink look, an all purple look, you can pull in the neutrals, you can do something really light and natural, or even something really dramatic and colorful. If you love pinks and purples, you are really going to enjoy this palette, and I do appreciate that there is a lot of range because, you know, for $65, I either want something that I'm going to reach for all the time, like the Bronze palette, Or if I'm buying more of like a colorful palette, I want to be able to create multiple colorful looks with it and not just the same look over and over, because sometimes when it comes to colorful palettes, for example, the ColourPop monochromatic palettes, I do find that when I use one of them, I get like the same pink look every time I use the pink palette, or I get the same purple look every time I use the purple palette. So with this one, I do feel like there's enough variety within the shadows that you can get different looks. Now, as for cons, when it comes to purple shadows or like berry tone shadows, they're notoriously hard to formulate. So I do find that a couple of these matte shadows are a little bit more difficult to work with. Whenever I use this palette, I love how my eyeshadow turns out, and in the end I always get a super intense, vibrant look if that's what I'm going for, but it does take a little bit of effort to get there. So this is not a palette I'm going to reach for if I'm in a hurry and I want a look in like 2 minutes. This is the palette that I'm going to reach for if I have a little extra time and I don't mind putting in a little bit more work into the blending. If you are a beginner with eyeshadow or you truly want like a super blendable, effortless palette, this might not be the most ideal option for you, because I do find that a lot of these deeper matte shadows require just a little bit of extra effort. Again, I always like how my look turns out, but for $65, you might want something that performs just a little bit easier. So as for similar palettes, I don't think I have anything in my collection that really looks like this. And I do have a lot of pink and purple tones, but I have them in random palettes. The only palettes that might come somewhat close would be the ColourPop monochromatic palettes, but even comparing them to this palette, the shades just don't line up. This one truly is a unique palette, and there's nothing like it in my collection. As I was going through the Natasha Denona website, I would say that the cranberry palette was maybe somewhat similar to this one, but that's really the only one that I would compare it to. So if you do love pink and purple eyeshadow as much as I do, this is going to be a great option for you. Okay, let's finish up with the Natasha Denona Sunrise palette. This was the first medium-sized palette that I purchased from the brand, the first one they actually released, and I do love this one. I think I have an entire dedicated review to this on my channel, which I'll link below. And again, it is colorful like the Love palette, but it's a lot different. This one has pinks and purples, yellows and orange, and then also a few neutrals as well, and it is more warm-toned than the Love palette. So this palette has 7 matte shadows, so I think it actually has the most matte out of any of the 4 palettes. So if you guys really love matte shadows, that might be a pro for you. And then it does have 8 shimmers. Now within those shimmers, 5 of the shimmers are like true metallic shadows, and then 3 of them are duochromes. So this one has, again, the most duochromes. The duochrome shadows aren't quite as vibrant as the true metallic shadows, so I tend to use them more so as like an eyeshadow topper. What sets this palette apart for me is the fact that there is so much range within this palette. I would say that the Love palette has a good amount of range, but this one probably has more, because on the right side of the palette you get like those lighter, neutral, everyday tones, and then in the middle of the palette you get some colorful medium tone shadows. On the left side you get some really intense dramatic shadows, so you can create so many different looks using this, whether you're doing a very simple, easy, everyday look, which is kind of one of my go-tos with this palette, or something more colorful, more intense. I don't own a lot of yellow shadows, so those obviously add to my collection as well, and there's just a lot going on within this one. This palette as a whole feels very unique to my collection, and I think it kind of pushes me to do something a little bit different from what I normally do. Now it is more warm toned, but I love the fact that you get a lot of those berry tone shadows, because those are shadows that I love to wear. I actually love using this one and the Love palette together because I think they balance each other out really well, but on its own it's a really nice palette to have in my collection as well. Now as for cons, I do experience some patchiness with the matte shadows in this palette, especially the darker shades. The lighter shades are pretty easy to work with, but again, those berry tones are notorious for being hard to formulate, so that could kind of play into it, but I find that when I use the shade Clove or the shade Glory, or even sometimes the shade Carnelian, I tend to get a little bit more of a patchy look overall, especially compared to other matte shadows that I've tried from the brand. I also feel like some of the duochromes are a little bit more difficult to work with. The shade Aster is amazing in the palette, but when you apply it to the eyes, it's very subtle. It doesn't show up that well. And sometimes duochromes by nature are meant to be used as topper shadows. They're a little bit lighter, a little bit softer, but I've tried a lot of duochromes that are significantly better than this one. This one is definitely the most inconsistent in terms of formula for me. And when you're paying $65 for a palette, I think you want the majority, if not all of the shadows to perform pretty much flawlessly, because these are some of the most expensive palettes that I've seen. $15. So I do feel like the quality on this palette could be improved quite a bit, especially compared to the Bronze palette or the Glam palette. So as for similar palettes, I do think the Natasha Denona Mini Sunset palette is pretty similar. Obviously that one was based on her full-size Sunset palette, but Sunrise, Sunset, I feel like all of the colors are kind of, you know, very, very similar. So if you have the Mini Sunset palette, you could probably create some similar looks. Obviously that one only comes with 5 shadows and this one comes with 15, but I did want to mention that one. As for other similar palettes, I don't really have anything in my collection to compare to this one. When I did my initial review, I mentioned a couple like the Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance, but any palette that I mentioned was more of like a subdued version of this palette. I don't have anything quite as intense or vibrant as this in my collection right now. One thing I did want to mention is that on the Natasha Denona website, she does have a bundle where you can get the Sunrise palette and the Love palette for $110. So obviously if you purchase them separately, that would be $130. And if you purchase them together as a bundle, you save $20. Obviously that's only a good deal if you were planning on buying both of them, but I did want to throw it out there in case both of these palettes appealed to you. So to summarize, if you want the best quality and the most consistent formula, I would go with the Natasha Denona Bronze Palette. Basically all of these shadows perform extremely well and I don't have any issues with them. The worst quality and the most inconsistent would be the Sunrise. There are shadows in here that perform very well. I love this palette. I love using it, but overall there are probably like 4 or 5 shadows that just aren't great compared to a lot of her other formulas. That being said, I think that this palette has the most variety. So if you're looking to get a lot of different looks out of the palette, I would recommend this one because you can create quite a few different looks. There's the most range within this palette overall. The least amount of variety would be the Natasha Denona Bronze Palette. You tend to get a very similar look when you use this palette, and that can be good if you do like more of a medium toned bronzy eyeshadow look, but if you're paying $65 and you want to get a range of looks, this is going to be the least ideal option for you. If you're looking for a colorful or unique palette, I would go with the Love or the Sunrise depending on your color preferences. And if you're just looking for like an everyday neutral palette that you'll be able to use over and over, then I would go with the Glam or the Bronze. If she released these 2 palettes first, I don't know that I would have purchased Sunrise or Love. Probably Love because those are kind of my go-to shades. I just ended up buying Sunrise because I was so curious about the formula at this price point, but looking back, this is probably my least used. Now, if I'm ranking them based on personal preference, number 1 is the Bronze palette. If I lost it or I broke it, I would totally run out and purchase it again right away. Number 2 is the Love palette. I think the tones in there are so beautiful, and even though it takes a little bit of extra blending or effort, I always love how my look turns out when I use it. Number 3 would be the Glam palette. That might move up. It's still a little bit newer to my collection, but I do enjoy it, and I think it's come in handy quite a bit because I don't have a ton of cooler tones in my collection. And then number 4 would be the Sunrise. I think at this point, a lot of her palettes are better than Sunrise. I think it's still really gorgeous, but it's not one that I would repurchase again if I did lose it or if I broke it. But that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope today's video was helpful if you are trying to decide which palette to try, which one to pick up. If you guys already own these, let me know in the comment section below what you think, how you would rank them, which one is your favorite, your least favorite. But thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Stay tuned because I will film that video where I do 2 looks using each one of the palettes. That should be up in the next few weeks, but I'll see you very soon with a new video. Bye.